Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest episode of 1812 with Josh and Jimmy. And tonight, they're very professional Jimmy, saying hello to the audience. And tonight we're talking, how have you written it down? Fact or fiction? War and Peace, fact or fiction, or something like that?
Yes, something like that.
We know exactly what we're doing. Yes. Well, we basically criticize Leo Tolstoy's interpretation of the campaign of 1812. And tell you where the pitfalls are if you're actually going to set out to read it. Because chances are, if you are interested in 1812, popularly speaking, you're probably going to be thinking of War and Peace.
It is one of the most famous works of literature out there, and it is one of the few which actually deal with this period of Russian history.
I think we actually, as I said before, there's a ridiculous dearth. You know, you have Sharp and you have Hornblower and you have Patrick O'Brien and all these people talking about the British fighting the French. And there's no Russian heroes, no 1812 swashbuckling adventurers running around. It's all War and Peace. It's all dominated by War and Peace.
Yes, and Tolstoy's heroes are, on the whole, more intellectual, let's say.
First off, I think we both would like to say, for the record, no matter what we say in this video, for my part, I love War and Peace. It's probably my favorite classical novel.
It's certainly up there, and we both wholeheartedly encourage you to read it as a work of fiction and as a work of literature, rather than.
Yeah, but please don't get your history from it.
Yes. If you want history, firstly, look back at our previous episodes where we go in quite a lot of depth on the 1812 campaign, but also consider something like Dominic Leaven's Russia Against Napoleon, which is a far more objective account of what went on during these years.
Absolutely. I actually had looked today to see if I could find out when it was I read War and Peace, and it was apparently, according to Twitter, in the autumn of 2013, where I read the Wordsworth edition, the really cheap paperback, which at least that translation was the one approved by Leo Tolstoy himself,
yes.
And apparently, I read it in 40 days.
That's quite impressive. I think I read it in maybe almost around the same time, maybe in the summer of 2012, because I just graduated from secondary school, and there was quite a long gap until university, and therefore I was like, why not?
Why not, indeed? I actually had tried to read it twice before and had failed both times. The first was because a friend of mine got it and I felt challenged, therefore, to buy it myself. That was the wrong reason to read it, because I just didn't continue. The second reason was because I suddenly became interested in the campaign of 1812 and again got distracted again. This time, I started reading it and it stuck, and I became addicted to it. And it saw me through, pretty much the autumn.
Yeah, I think when I read it, it was already after I had got into Russian literature and many things to do with Russia, and I can't remember whether I already read Leaven's Russia Against Napoleon. I probably did. I had the advantage of reading the real the real history before.
I did not. I did not. I just read it.
No.
I just read it, so I was the reverse. And one of the things I remember take as a positive to anybody thinking about reading it, read it. Okay.
Yes.
Everything you have heard about it is wrong popularly. Okay, for a start. All right. This is I'm saying this because everything I thought about it when I picked it up to read it for the third try was wrong. I expected to be lost. I expected to not be able to keep track of the story. I expected it to basically bore the life out of me. And that's all wrong as far as I'm concerned.
Admittedly, if you're not familiar with Russian names, you may have a bit of a task in keeping track of all the 500 characters.
That's true. That is true. I'm not going to say that it's the easiest of reads if you're not a big reader or something like that. But I wasn't particularly familiar with Russian names when I read it. And I was able to keep track of who was who quite easily, really, because you get it from context to begin with, and then you just know who it is.
Yeah. I think on the whole, it's not too bad on that account. But I do think it depends on the translation. But I think sometimes if you have patronymics and things that can
yes,
that can confuse people.
I really enjoyed that bit.
So I think we should actually talk a little about the context in which Tolstoy wrote War and Peace. It came out sort of in a serialized form over the course of the mid 1860s. But Tolstoy actually had the idea of writing something which became War and Peace around the mid-50s. And this was when Tsar Alexander II just acceded to the throne. And he issued an amnesty for all of the surviving Decembrist exiles in Siberia to return to essentially to European Russia was one of them. So Tolstoy, he wanted to write a book about the Decembrists and how they ended up trying to overthrow the Tsar.
I mean, actually, it's interesting that War and Peace that he originally envisaged began where it ends, with different characterizations and backstories and stuff, but it kind of ends where it was intended to begin, I think I read somewhere.
When Tolstoy looked back at the Decembrists, he realized that a lot of them had served as young officers in the Russian army during the 1813 and 1814 campaigns. So Tolstoy knew that he had to go back to 1813 and 14. And then with that, he knew that he had to go back to 1812 and the national patriotic struggle against Napoleon. And once he realized that he needed to write about 1812, he realized that he needed to go back even further, and that is where we have the famous. Well, I say famous opening lines. I can't actually quote it in French.
That is the famous opening line that everybody wishes they could open a door with the aplomb of this woman, and just barrage your guest with aha, so Genoa and Lucca are now just possessions of the Bonaparte family, eh?
But I think this is a very interesting beginning, because they're in the salon of a lady in waiting of the Dowager Empress,
Anna Pavlovna Scherer.
That's right. And they're speaking French. This is 1805. We still have quite a few Francophiles among the. Well, they don't necessarily need to be Francophiles. They were just brought up speaking French because French culture and the generally sort of Western European culture was what St. Petersburg was all about. That's kind of how St. Petersburg came into being, through the will of Peter the Great. But then, over the course of the novel, you get less French being used in the salons. You get the aristocrats trying to actually learn Russian and or to improve their Russian. And sometimes that's actually through the help of their servants or serfs. And Tolstoy really charts the way in which Russian society shifts from being, in a sense, more cosmopolitan and more more francophone, to one which is more, not so much nationalist, but certainly a greater degree of national consciousness, and where these Russian nobles actually begin to look at themselves and actually say, oh yes, we are Russian and we should be speaking Russian and we should be doing stuff that Russian people do, which mainly involves becoming closer to their Russian servants and their serfs. And that doesn't necessarily mean
and wolf hunting and peasant dancing and things like that.
And this is also reflected in the development of Zhukov, who I think is really the character through which the novel pivots around. And you more often than not, you see the world from Pierre's perspective. And so initially, he is, he's this illegitimate son of a count, and he's sort of milling around.
It's Pierre's never-ending journey to find meaning in life,
Right.
And it leads him to Borodino to try and help.
And admittedly, a lot of Russian nobles with hardly any military experience at all do sign up for various militias, either Moscow or St. Petersburg. But Pierre just seems to turn up on the battlefield.
He just goes there to see Andre.
I want to see my mate. See how he's doing. It leads him to Borodino, and then he ends up. He doesn't get captured at Borodino.
Oh no! He gets another idea after Borodino.
After Borodino, he comes up with a harebrained scheme to assassinate Napoleon.
Yes, because he thinks he's read it in the stars or something, hasn't he? That he's destined.
Because somehow Napoleon Bonaparte corresponds to the number 666, and then and this is again sort of dabbling with mysticism. He tries to spell out his name, and finds out that it gets very close to 666, but is not quite there. So therefore, he tries various combinations and various variations of his name until he stumbles up on Le Russe Bezuhot.
Jamming that peg into the square hole there.
Right. It's completely ridiculous, and just but he's like, okay, I'm in a pretty much abandoned Moscow. I'm gonna, I've got my sights on him, but then he doesn't do anything. He sort of, I think it's interesting because I think someone like Pierre, someone who's sort of been brought up in a gentleman, who's never sort of got very close to the army at all, apart from knowing a lot of people, he just can't bring himself to kill anyone.
Yeah.
And
the duel that he fights completely sends him down a rabbit hole for a start.
Yes,
so
that's true. That is true.
He doesn't even get he doesn't get captured because he tries to kill Napoleon. He gets captured because he gets into a fight with some people about trying to protect some peasants, and doesn't he?
Something like that. Yes. No. It's
Oh, they think he's an arsonist.
Right. No. That's it. Yeah. Because they just see him being rather sneaky.
Yeah.
And believe that he's trying to burn stuff down. And then he gets captured, and he ends up once the French abandon Moscow, he ends up as their prisoner on the retreat, and he sort of pals up with a fellow prisoner named Platon Karateyev, who introduces to him the mysteries of the potato
and the Russian soul. It is embodied in this vegetable.
and essentially, the idea is that you don't need all the world's possessions to be happy. All you need is to appreciate what the Lord has given you, and that's
potato and a dog.
What else does a man need in life?
Platon says nothing. Nothing else is needed.
But with this potato and sprinkling a bit of salt on it and savoring every bite, you realize what true happiness is, rather than just being surrounded by all the glitz and glamour of St. Petersburg and failing to appreciate what's important in life. And then Platon freezes to death.
Yes.
And Pierre, somehow gets rescued by some Russians, and returns to St. Petersburg with a greater appreciation of the.
He's found the meaning that he's been looking for.
So essentially, Pierre's journey is a reflection of the journey that much of Russian aristocracy takes from being more cosmopolitan and francophone to being far more rooted in the land and having a greater communion with the Russian people and, by extension, the Russian soil. So there are two competing narratives that actually emerge from Russia's experience of the Napoleonic Wars. And one of them is the more sort of national patriotic one, and arguably more conservative one, which is, as we have said, trying to realize that you are Russian, and therefore having a closer relationship with not only the Russian land, the Russian peasantry, but also the Russian God. A uniquely Russian way of life, which is not really found in the rest of Europe. And then there is the alternative strand, which you kind of see in a lot of the Decembrists, which is the more liberal constitutionalist imagination, where Russia, these guys have seen what sort of rights and freedoms that the French people get to enjoy and feel like transferring that to Russia. So it's sort of two sides of the same coin, because the more sort of conservative Slavophile narrative is for the nobility to become more like the peasantry, whereas the alternative, sort of more westernizing concept is for the peasants to become more like aristocrats, or at least sort of more civilized and more having greater political rights. So that's an interesting sort of juxtaposition between the two schools of thought that emerged as a result of Russia's experience of the Napoleonic Wars. And certainly the more conservative one was dominant during, especially during the reign of Nicholas the First, and you had a greater sort of push towards more Russianness, and you see that with sort of Russification policies in places like Poland and the Baltics.
And I suppose what Tolstoy would fall into the conservative category, or is he more? Because obviously he has sympathies with the Decembrists, but he is trying to be very Slavophile.
So yes. So actually, this the Slavophile, the Slavophile conservative and the Westernizer liberal dichotomy is not particularly helpful, because there were Slavophiles who were also reformers and who wanted something more egalitarian, and Tolstoy was certainly among them. And in fact, when it came to the emancipation of the serfs, which came a couple of years before the first volume of or the first half of War and Peace was published, it was a more Slavophile idea of setting up these or preserving the village communes. So the rationale behind the emancipation reform was more Slavophile than it was Westernizing. And
interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have anything more to say, or do you want to go on with the hatchet job?
Let's go on. Do you want to say something, or?
Well, let's. Okay. How we're going to focus on, I guess, the 1812 portion. I suppose, historically speaking.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that more than 1805, certainly.
Yeah, and it should be noted that Tolstoy chose to not talk at all, not only about 1813 and 14, but he also missed out 1807. And, I guess reasons of space, but...
I don't think Tolstoy really cared about space.
Probably not, but...
I think with 1806, it's interesting, because what he does mention is the Peace of Tilsit, and I think it is particularly interesting because his argument is that Russians only win on Russian soil, or Russians fight better on Russian soil, and therefore actually the Russians didn't do that badly in the 1807 campaign. And therefore, to sort of portray Russian victories in 1807 is sort of distracting from the narrative that the Russians only win when they're fighting for their own native soil.
I get it. Yeah, I mean, the high of Eylau and then the crushing low of Friedland might have been something, but I'm not going to argue with him. If that's his point, that's the point he wanted to make. And so he, in 1812 in the book, begins, as far as I've been able to see from looking at this translation, which is one of the later translations, fairly modern actually. I think it's not too old.
I think it's probably 2014 or something.
Something like that. It starts in book numeral, which is in numerals, book 12 of part 1. Book 12 of part 1, apparently, which is almost exactly halfway through the book. And then note that Borodino occurs in book 19 of part 2. That's just over 100 pages between the beginning of the retreat from Smolensk and then Borodino. That's just over 100 pages. 30 of which are dedicated are dedicated to the retreat from Smolensk, and then the rest is like, because War and Peace is War and Peace. There is war bits and there at home. So that's Smolensk to Borodino, and he spends most of that time The most egregious part I found in that is his total and embracing acceptance of Barclay de Tollet's and Russian incompetence. Because he like cherry picks letters of Bagration moaning to is it Prince Arakcheyev?
It's
Count
Yes.
Arakcheyev, about how it wasn't my fault we abandoned Smolensk, which he lifted out of is it Bogdanovich's History of the Great Patriotic War of 1812. So that's where this is where the critique begins, essentially. And Jimmy's going to be much more coherent than I am, but that's what I found to begin with.
Right. So I think just a disclaimer on this as well, that actually, on the whole, Tolstoy is very good with, and he did meticulous research for the book, and he spent a good 6 months at the Borodino battlefield doing research and looking around and seeing what it all looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should definitely say that. I have the greatest respect for Tolstoy's ability to do historical fiction.
And he read all the histories of the campaign from both perspectives, and therefore he rarely gets his facts wrong, apart from where it's unavoidable for the purposes of the narrative. So, one particular example is that Nikolai Rostov's regiment, the Pavlograd Hussars, are actually not part of the main army as it retreats from, firstly from Vitebsk, but all the way back to Borodino. But it's actually in Tormasov's Third Army. But because Rostov has to be, at Borodino and at the campaign, then Tolstoy has to put them there. So that's one of the occasions where a bit of
license.
Yes, literary license employed by Tolstoy. But as you say, the main issue is the interpretation of everything, because
it's not as if the Russians did not feel this way. It's actually accurately representing a way a lot of Russian people, like officers like Bagration, felt.
Yes,
that Barclay was this German idiot, coward. But at the same time, Tolstoy completely accepts this.
Yeah, and he also, and it's also a rather blunt description of what's going on at Russian headquarters, because actually it's not as easy as Russians versus Germans, because let us remind ourselves, as Bagration needed reminding from Barclay, that Bagration himself is not ethnic Russian. He is a Georgian. He is from a Georgian. His lineage is from the Georgian royal family, and he doesn't really have a. I don't think he actually has a drop of Russian blood in him.
Unlike Barclay de Tollet.
Who
has a drop.
Yeah. And also, it's the way that he lumps Barclay and Clausewitz together with someone like General Full, the guy who comes up with this idea of the Drissa camp and so on. And he's just portraying all these Russian officers going, oh, look at all those German idiots over there. They think that we can fight a battle on this ridiculous camp. And in actual fact, both Clausewitz and Barclay were just like, this fool is a ridiculous person. Why on earth does the Tsar trust him so much and trust his advice so much? So have different perspectives among the Germans as well. At the Council of Fili, Bennigsen was the most was the greatest proponent of fighting a battle outside Moscow, and Barclay was his chief opponent in that. But eventually, it was Kutuzov, the very Russian, who made the ultimate decision to abandon Moscow. So it's not so straightforward as trying to give the impression that, oh yeah, there were these bunch of Germans who just
a bunch of mercenaries who don't care about Russia at all, kind of
thing. Right. Who are sort of so interested in the minutiae of drill and of tactics and everything that they kind of forget that the Russian soldier doesn't really care about sort of lining up perfectly, but prefers to bayonet charge into the enemy position and take it by storm. That's
the Council of Feely bit is really all about Kutuzov. Really, he does a description which is represented in the famous painting, and it's obviously very good Tolstoyan description, but nobody really gets to talk very much except Kutuzov, and I guess Beyondkatusov says a little bit, and he gives a little benevolent smile to Barclay when he calls him the sensible Barclay, but he still paints him as a retreating general at the head of a clique of German idiots. So, and actually, I think I don't know if you agree, but the legacy of this is that everybody up to a certain point, until certain revisions were done in favor of Barclay, pretty much has a great deal to do with why everybody just continued to say that Barclay they just accepted this Tolstoyan view.
Yeah, so that's true to a large extent. I think even before that, while Barclay was written quite positively into the official histories, I think there was still a sense of his not being Russian, or at least not being as Russian as Kutuzov and Bagration, and therefore not really deserving of the same degree of praise, at least among the greater, the wider population. And obviously he had statues. A large statue in St. Petersburg outside the Kazan Cathedral, and stuff, and the full-length portrait in the 1812 gallery. But apart from official recognition, there wasn't, in terms of and I think it was the case even among the army, even if they respected Barclay as the Fabius, as the strategist who managed to lure Napoleon into the heart of Russia. I think there was still an element of not so much suspicion as such, but the fact that he was tied to these terrible scenes at Smolensk and at Moscow, where perhaps it could have been avoided when it comes to the Soviet how 1812 is remembered and how it's alluded to during the Great Patriotic War, because you have the orders of Suvorov and Kutuzov for army commanders, and you have Operation Bagration, which named for a major operation of the Second World War, during which the Red Army conquered Belarus.
I mean,
which incidentally
was where. Point.
Incidentally, was where Bagration's Second Army was stationed during the initial stages of the 1812 campaign. So
that's such a good point, though, because Barclay de Tolly has Baltic German connections, and the Soviets are not therefore going to be too inclined to use him as a rallying cry for pure Russian Soviet ideals. Unfortunately, I think you've hit the nail on the head, that quite apart from Tolstoy, whose kind of brusque treatment of Barclay fits into the basic narrative that they're trying to promote. The Soviets can't celebrate Barclay, and the Great Patriotic War, it almost obliterates everything else in national memory for the next decade or so, I would think.
Right. At least for the rest of Stalin's period in power, and that's when, as you say, Barclay is German. He's Baltic German, and during this time, the Baltics are not exactly integrated into the Soviet Union. So there's no real way at this time to describe. It's only in 1962, with the 150th anniversary, you do begin to have some sort of reassessment of Barclay, and he appears on stamps and stuff like that, and still below Kutuzov and Bagration, but creeping up, and very much, I think, number 3 in the pecking order.
This thing about the Germans and the Russians is one of the big kind of false trails that you can be led down by Tolstoy's excellent writing, and his general commitment to accuracy as well, because you can be fooled by the bits he gets right into thinking everything is right, because he's very good in military affairs and things like that.
He's very good sort of at the micro level, but it's the macro level where, and the sort of, and his interpretations about history and nationalism and war and strategy. That's where it sort of falls apart when it comes to actual history.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the toughest things about reading War and Peace is his lengthy digressions into the philosophical nature of history and warfare, and his commentary on Napoleon's ability to fight wars and things like that. And bear in mind, Tolstoy, what was I don't remember what rank he achieved in the Russian army, but he got no higher than captain.
I think it was lieutenant or something.
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't. He wasn't particularly senior in the Russian army, but he did serve during the Crimean War and at the siege of Sevastopol, and he wrote very vividly about that in his Sevastopol sketches.
Another excellent read, by the way, but that's for another.
But basically, and he served in the artillery. So he was an artillery officer, and he really could only see what was in front of his gun barrel, which was the way you put it in our last video.
Yeah, and he can only see what's over the barrel of his gun.
Yeah. And depending on circumstances, that can be a lot, or that can be very little.
But as a junior officer in command, or like as part of a field battery, that's just your job. You look about what's immediately problematic to you, and that's all you need to care about.
Exactly. You don't really need to care about what's going on in other sectors of the battlefield. You may have a natural curiosity and speculate on what's going on. But fundamentally, if you are a trained officer in any army, especially a low-ranking officer, then your job is literally what is in front of you. And that is to make sure that your guns are not captured.
Yeah.
And if you can inflict a bunch of casualties on the enemy, then that's a bonus.
But Tolstoy kind of projects this junior officer's mindset onto practically everybody.
Right.
Arguing that you'd have no control over the things you are trying to do, essentially.
Yeah, and he basically claims that at Borodino, Napoleon and Kutuzov were no better than actors. They were just their orders didn't really mean anything because people were just doing what they were doing on the front lines. Now, this isn't. There is a kernel of truth in that, especially when it comes to Borodino, because neither Kutuzov nor Napoleon actually took that many decisions. Arguably, their main role for both armies was as a sort of rallying, sort of a point of inspiration. You know, the fact that they were still there, they were still alive, they were still was worth, you know, was worth still fighting for. But Tolstoy is of this opinion that actually Napoleon and Kutuzov themselves had no idea what was going on. Well, there was no way. Battlefield communications is not like what it is nowadays. There's no way you can instantly get an idea of what's going on in another sector of the battlefield. You do need to send someone there to report back on what they're seeing and what's going on. And by the time they're back, maybe things have changed. So, you know, you can sort of understand these generals not being completely 100% aware of what's going on all the time, but still they will have a general idea of what's going on. And even if, especially with a battle like Borodino, even if the news is like 30 minutes out of date, that's not so much of a problem when, yeah, the Bagration flèches, they change hands several times. Basically means, this sector needs some strengthening. I will therefore move some of my reserves closer to that sector. It doesn't really matter that during the time that the report has come back that you've lost that position, because you're probably going to take it back pretty soon.
Yeah. The simple fact is that, I mean, first of all, you only need to look at Barclay and Bagration to realize that senior generals can know quite instantly what's going on if they want to. I mean, the Kutuzov style of command, where you sit on a hill further back, is very, very old-fashioned, sort of even mythic kind of idea. And actually, the modern way of doing Borodino is very strange for that reason. It's quite odd that two senior generals are not sort of closer involved with what's going on. Certainly, I'm just going to use Wellington as an excuse, sort of like an example here, as the most extreme example, perhaps. He very rarely would not know what was going on in most parts of a battlefield. It's perfectly possible for a commanding general, is the point, despite what Tolstoy says emphatically, for a commanding general to know within, like you say, a margin of sometimes up to half an hour, depending how big the field is.
Right, exactly. Borodino was actually quite a small field.
Yeah.
So that is definitely an issue, and that's why Tolstoy basically gives the impression that actually what happens, who determines sort of victory or defeat, and this is actually quite a sort of Clausewitzian approach or interpretation, is that actually the side with the more sort of enthused warriors, the troops who have more of a reason to fight are the ones who end up prevailing. And that obviously ties in very well with the idea that this is a sort of national war for Russia, whereas Napoleon has this multinational army, 12 different languages or whatever, and it means that a lot of these guys are fighting a long way from home. And when you're face to face with the enemy, do you really fight for stuff like glory and honor and a bunch of medals, or is it really about saving your skin?
And to be honest, Tolstoy kind of makes that point as well at the same time, in kind of a way. His writing on war is like,
he does. I think he does actually make that point pretty well. And that's
it's sort of encapsulated in Andrei's arc more than the others, but
right. And I think
maybe Nikolai's as well. Nikolai and Andrei kind of encapsulate the
right, because initially they have the sort of idea of sort of martial glory and coming back laden with trophies to show the ladies and everything. But eventually they kind of realize it's just a question of life and death.
Yeah.
And I think Tolstoy actually does this quite well, because when we are talking about generals and strategy and all that, we can forget about the actual rank and file and the ones who are actually involved in in the dirty work. But at the same time, it basically Tolstoy gives the impression that wars are always won on this basis, and that sort of generalship and military leadership doesn't really count for anything at all, because he just considers it irrelevant. And kind of tied to the idea of soldiers' motivation and national wars is his belief that history is essentially driven by contingency and by fate. And that's really, the moment Napoleon set foot in Russia, he was already lost. There's a reason why Tolstoy did not write about the 1813 and 1814 campaigns, because that would turn his interpretation of 1812 on a head.
Yeah, if Tolstoy's model was true, Napoleon would have been able to win, theoretically.
Yeah, and the whole sort of diplomatic sort of sphere kind of just doesn't, like, Tolstoy's interpretation doesn't sort of leave that much room for political decisions, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I may be wrong on that, actually. But
I mean, it's hard to disagree with that, because he doesn't really go into politics and diplomacy and things like that. He
doesn't write about it.
No. He probably could have, if he'd put one of his characters in the court rather than all in the army or in like or society. But so that's another thing with Tolstoy. That's another slight critique that some of us feel when we read War and Peace. Are you going to talk about the historiography? Did you say as well?
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered this a little in terms of how it impacted the Soviet interpretation.
Yeah. It was basically just we were talking about Barclay's kind of legacy. But it's also got what's its wider kind of
and how it basically the Soviets basically took Tolstoy and took it a step further. So like Kutuzov becomes the greatest of all time, and Barclay is relegated. Yes, the Tsar is pretty much nowhere to be seen.
Unsurprisingly, on that score, I mean.
But also, you have, and Tolstoy does rather vividly portray the partisan war with Denisov and with Petya Rostov, tragically participating in one of these raids and getting himself killed as a result. For the Soviets, clearly the partisan narrative was quite important, because it was the idea of this of these sort of peasants uprooted from their land, who sort of, as a result of their sort of righteous anger, decide to armed with pitchforks and whatever implements they can find, start hacking away. And therefore both Tolstoy and especially the Soviets, they really don't appreciate the contribution of the Russian generals beyond Kutuzov.
It's interesting that you said that, because it's a bigger part, the retreat, but it's not exactly novelized, and it's the only novelized bits are the partisan bits, really. And it basically just discusses why the French army were able to escape, and more about fate and man's destiny and things like that. and it's a weird bit because it just ends like that, the actual war.
Yeah, and it sort of gives the impression that Kutuzov chased them to the Berezina and allowed them to escape because the Russians had no business fighting beyond beyond Russian borders, despite the fact that the Russians kept on fighting beyond Russian borders. And indeed, Kutuzov, however reluctantly, led the army across Russian borders to pursue the retreating, the remnants of the Grand Armée. And the story doesn't end at Berezina. It ends really in March 1814, when the Russians, together with the Austrians and the Prussians, with some help on the side from the Swedes and the British, end up toppling Napoleon and replacing him, restoring the Bourbons. And the Russians, both as a result of political leadership on the part of the Tsar, and also the military contribution, played a massive role in Napoleon's defeat and his abdication. But we don't get any of that in War and Peace. So as a result, the Russian sort of psyche really, the general way that Russia's experience of the Napoleonic Wars is portrayed is that it's all about 1812, despite how the more successful parts of 1813 and 1814 are actually relatively forgotten about. And actually, Levin writes about this in Russia Against Napoleon. And in the book, he basically dedicates half the book to the 1813 and 1814 campaigns. Whereas a lot of histories of Russia and the Napoleonic Wars really, you've got 600 pages on 1812 and you've got like 50 on 1813 and 14.
And I think it's interesting as well to raise the point. People might ask, well, it is just a novel, so did people take it this seriously? Well, as far as I'm aware, it was required reading in Soviet schools.
Oh, yeah.
So it absolutely had an effect on how people viewed history. If you think about how many people get their history from Shakespeare when they're in school and things like that, then you can get some idea of what this can do. Maybe as you grow up, you would dismiss it eventually, but it is going to be there, this kind of idea, the ideas that he puts in.
Right, and especially for people who aren't particularly interested in the era. They're going to continue believing that this was what happened. And let's be honest here, that is the majority of the population.
Exactly, yes. They get it from books and they get it from movies, and that's fine with them.
And not everyone is like us, trying to actually find the truth. Which is absolutely fine. I think if everyone was a historian, I think society would grind to a halt.
Probably.
The economy would
dry out.
But actually, that's an interesting sort of tangent. Just to talk about, just to mention Tolstoy's quote about historians, and I can't remember whether this is in War and Peace or in something else, but I think he writes about historians. They answer questions which nobody asks, I think no disrespect to academic historians. Some of my best friends are academic historians, but he may have a point there.
There's a lot of truth in that. Yeah, there is.
all of us trying to find this new angle to approach the question, and like 5 people. Yeah.
Okay. Both of us and everybody else are just sort of shuffling awkwardly around about this question. But certainly, yeah, you cannot fault some of his incisive incisive observations. I think I might have actually read that today or something. He had something to say about historians that I read today when I was flipping through. He definitely says something about historians in War and Peace, although I think it's actually, again, quite dismissive. But
well, I mean, that's. I think he didn't really think that historians deserve to exist.
Yeah, Shakespeare hated lawyers, and Tolstoy hated historians, or something like that.
The conclusion we arrive at here is that Tolstoy is a brilliant writer, a brilliant novelist. Read War and Peace. I think 2 out of 3 of you will not regret it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So that's a better than 50% chance.
Yes. And Jimmy is now going to be writing the blurbs for all of Tolstoy's editions from now on the back of the book. 2 out of 3 of you will probably enjoy this.
Those are good. I feel like those are good odds for a classic, because as I believe this may have actually been apocryphal, as a lot of Mark Twain quotes are, but I think he said a classic is a book that you want to have read but you don't want to read.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the ones attributed to him, but there's so many attributed to Mark Twain. Right. It's difficult to figure out which ones. But it's true. It's true. Yeah. No, the classics are that. The classics are that. And so yes, read War and Peace. Read
War and Peace, but
remember it's a novel.
Just read some history around it as well.
Yeah. If you have no intention of reading history around it, remember it's a novel and talk about it like it's a novel, and then ask questions if you want, and the historians will answer them. So we've said read War and Peace about a dozen times now. So for this episode, I would like to say thank you for watching. Please do, as usual, the things you're supposed to do if you like the video, and which is like and subscribe and leave a comment. And if you have any questions, leave them in the boxes below. And I hope to see you again next time. Jimmy, do you want to say goodbye to the people?
Goodbye, people.
Bye, people.
Goodbye, YouTube.
Yep. Good night. Thank you and good night.